Good morning and welcome to this morning's live stream. We are happy to have you with us for our virtual presentation, this Texas Holocaust Remembrance Week. We are honored today to be joined by author Melissa W. Hunter, author of the book, What She Lost. Texas Holocaust Remembrance Week was established in 2019 with the passage of Senate Bill 1828 to educate Texas students about the history and lessons of the Holocaust. During this week, the Holocaust Memorial Museum of San Antonio is honored to bring speakers to school campuses to teach students about the Holocaust and inspire them in a sense of responsibility to recognize and uphold human value to prevent future atrocities. We're also proud to bring in some of our virtual speakers as well. At this time, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this morning, Melissa W. Hunter. Melissa is the author of What She Lost and Other Works, is a writer and blogger from Cincinnati, Ohio. She studied creative writing and journalism at the University of Cincinnati, receiving a BA in English literature and a minor in Judaic studies. She was awarded the English Department's Undergraduate Essay Award and Undergraduate Fiction Award over 2 consecutive years. In her senior year, she received a grant to study and write about the Holocaust at the United States Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. She is a contributing blogger to the Today Show parenting community, and her novella, Through a Mirror Clear, was published as a serial installment on the same blog, an online literary journal written for women by women, now available in its entirety on Amazon.com. Her novel, What She Lost, is inspired by her grandmother's life as a Holocaust survivor. She works as a freelance writer and blogs about the writing process and motherhood. When not at her computer, Melissa loves spending time with her family, husband, and 2 daughters. At this time, I'd like to welcome Melissa Hunter.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and good morning. It is such an honor to be invited to speak with you all today. As Jessica said, my name is Melissa Hunter, and I am an author from Cincinnati, Ohio. I'd like to thank the Holocaust Memorial Museum of San Antonio for this opportunity to share the story of a woman who is very special to me, my grandmother, Sala Wertheiser. She was a Holocaust survivor, and her life story was the inspiration for my debut novel, What She Lost. There's the cover of the book. You'll have to forgive me. I have a little bit of a tickle in my throat today. Okay, the next slide. Before I begin talking about my grandmother's life, I'd like to give you a little glimpse into my relationship with her. Growing up, I was very close to my grandmother. Some of my earliest memories are of the Friday nights we spent at my grandparents' home for Shabbat dinner. This was a weekly tradition. We lit the candles and said the prayers over the wine and challah. Our dinners consisted of a 4-course meal that always started with bagels and my grandmother's famous matzo ball soup, followed by egg salad, roasted chicken and potatoes, and ending with tzimmus, a dessert of stewed fruit. No family event was ever complete without a table full of food, and we always left with a full stomach. Next slide. On those evenings, my grandmother never sat down. I would follow her around the kitchen, listening to her talk as she worked. She spoke with a thick European accent, but I never had trouble understanding her. She was my bubby, and her voice was as familiar to me as my own. I don't know when I realized that she and my grandfather were from another country. I also don't know when I learned that they were Holocaust survivors. These details were something I just always knew. They were woven into their identity as much as the fact that my grandmother had bright red hair and my grandfather ran a feather factory. Next slide. In school, I discovered a passion for writing when my 8th grade English teacher assigned us a journal to write in. I kept many journals throughout middle and high school. And when I was in high school, I joined the literary magazine and newspaper. By the time I went to college, I knew that this was the path I wanted to pursue for my future. And my greatest dream was to write a novel. As I got older, my grandmother began to open up to me about her life in the concentration camps. I knew after hearing her stories that my first book would be about her, to honor her life and make sure that future generations wouldn't forget what she had lived through. So one afternoon about 20 years ago, I sat down with my grandmother and a small 8mm camera and interviewed her on her life. I used the information from our interview, along with a lot of research, to write my first novel, What She Lost. It's my pleasure to share parts of that interview and research with you today. Next slide. Before taking the name of Sala in a crowded immigration office on Ellis Island, my grandmother was known as Chaya Sarah, or as her family affectionately called her, Wilde Chaya, the wild one. She was born in Olkusz, Poland, where she grew up in a large Orthodox family. In the following slide, my grandmother shares a little bit about her childhood.
You've told me lots of stories about growing up in Poland with your family. Can you describe for me your mom and your dad a little bit?
My mother was a very beautiful lady. She had hair like really yours, auburn, you know, and she had dark eyes. My father was very religious, so was my mom. My father was Orthodox, you know, and he was a wonderful father. 7 kids, and in Poland was a different life. You know, we didn't have frigidaires, we didn't have wash machine, nothing. My mother had warm water on the stove to take a bath for us. So first she bathed the 2 daughters and then the 5 sons, you know. It was like a barrel to put in
Like
them,
a tub?
like a tub, you know. And it was a hard life.
Next slide.
You've told me lots of stories.
My grandmother had 6 siblings. The oldest was her sister, Esther, followed by her brothers, Jacob, Sam, and Isaac. The youngest were her twin brothers, David and Mayer. My grandmother shared a deep bond with her sister and was extremely close to her twin brothers. In these next 2 slides, she talks about these relationships and her memories of her time with her family.
Your family life before this all happened, there was your mom and dad.
Mom and dad.
And you had
5 brothers and me, my sister.
Esther. Right, Esther was your sister.
Right, yeah.
And your oldest brother's name was Jacob, is that
Jacob.
right? He played the violin.
Yes, he was the one when he was 3-4 years. I'm never going to forget this. He even played cornetto, you know.
Did he?
My mother used to love this to hear. He was really, I can see the violin, Melissa, on the wall. Then he left. My mother said, that's what's left.
Wow. And this was when he left to go into the war or to go
To the
concentration camp. Your family.
And in this slide, my grandmother talks about the little ones, the twins, and she was very much a mother figure to them when they were at home together.
So what about, who were you, if you had to pick a sibling that you were closest to or you related to the most, who would you say it was?
I like the little ones, the twins.
Did you?
Very much so.
Why?
Because they were the youngest. The other, they were fine, but the twins, they always stick to me.
Did
twins.
they?
Yeah.
You were kind of like a second mother to them?
Exactly.
Oh, did you play with them?
Oh yeah, a lot.
What kind of stuff did you play?
Oh, we played ball and we throw the ball on the wall, you know. Whatever we could, we played. But they were such good kids.
Were they identical twins?
No, they weren't.
Okay. What is one of your happiest memories of childhood?
To be home with the family.
Everyone at home together?
Yeah, together.
So what?
On September 5th, 1939, when my grandmother was a young teenager, the Germans occupied Olkusz. In this clip, my grandmother remembers what it was like for her to experience the Nazis' occupation of Poland.
When you grew up, you went to school,
Yes.
public school, and then you said that was when the Germans came in, that ended.
That was the end of it.
Okay.
No more Jews in school.
What was it like for you and your family when all this started happening? Did you guys think that it would go as far as it went? What kind of...
We wasn't sure that they gonna, invade, that they not gonna let us live. We didn't know because the concentration, Auschwitz was not far away where I used to live.
Mm-hmm.
Later on, before I went to camp, I could see the flames.
Oh, really?
We could see up in the sky the flames.
Where was this now? When you were in the city or in the suburbs?
That was Auschwitz. That was a city.
So this is when you were actually living in the city?
Yeah,
You saw the
that's
flames?
right, not in the suburb. We seen the flame, and my mother said always to my father, "Let us leave." And my father said, "Where would you go?" So there was other little cities, but they throw the Jews in the water. They drowned them. So my mother said, "No, I want to be all together."
Right.
So
she wanted
we
to
didn't go. She said, "When not, the life to end. They're going to throw my kids down and me and my husband,
So you mean other Jews tried to escape and went to
They
other
did.
cities?
Yes,
but
and they
the
throw them
Poles...
down, and I'm never going to forget this. Neighbors of us.
How did you
Neighbors.
find out about it?
We heard about that. They never came back.
Really?
One major event that occurred in Olkusz was something that came to be known as Bloody Wednesday. This historical event is documented in a number of sources. On July 31st, 1940, the Nazis gathered all the Jewish men over the age of 14 to be registered. They were subjected to hours of bullying and torture, forced to lay face down in the town square, and beaten if they moved. Next slide. In the summer of 2021, I was approached by an independent director of a film series called Generation to Generation. He was documenting the life story of survivors as told by their descendants. And together, we recorded a documentary about my grandmother's life and my novel. The following scene is taken from this documentary and talks about what happened during Bloody Wednesday.
During the summer of 1940, Sarah had recently turned 15, and in the 10 months since, the Germans had occupied her town. She witnessed their brutality and cruelty grow bolder with each passing day. But on July 31st, 1940, humanity was no longer a part of the Nazi vocabulary.
On July 31st, 1940, my grandmother was woken up very early in the morning by pounding on her door, on her family's door. There was a German soldier, a Nazi, that had come to the door and demanded that her father and her oldest brothers come with him. This was before dawn had even broken. She described this to me in great detail. She said that they left, leaving my grandmother and her mother and the twins, who were very young at the time, at home. And she didn't know for most of the day what was taking place. And what ended up happening was the men 14 and older in the town of Olkusz were rounded up and taken to the center of town, where they were forced to lie face down on the town square all day. They were not allowed to move. They weren't allowed to use the restroom. Many of them were beaten. Many of them were ridiculed, and they had to register as being Jewish at that time in the town. And what I came to discover in the research that I did was this was not unusual activity in small cities throughout Poland. But what made this a very interesting part for me to learn about history was that the Germans used Olkusz as propaganda. They had photographers there. So there is footage, there's history of what happened that day in Olkusz. And I look at those pictures that I found online, and try and think who among those bodies lying there in the town square is my great-grandfather and my great-uncles, because they were one of many. They did not return home until later that day, and as my grandmother said, they were broken. My great-grandfather came through the door and collapsed and cried, and it was really the first experience that they had of the humiliation and the dehumanization that the Nazis continued to perpetuate throughout the war.
In September of 1941, Jews were displaced from the center of Olkish to the ghetto, established in the suburbs or rural area outside the town limits. Jews were allowed to transport their belongings to the quarter by carts, which were assigned by the Jewish community. Houses were emptied systematically according to streets. This displacement lasted about 10 days. Jews were informed about the displacement a few days beforehand. Each Jew received a call from the Displacement Commission of the Judenrat and had to pay a certain amount of money for a flat. Housing conditions in the quarter were very hard. Those who paid a lot of money got better flats. The poor lived in one room for 7 or 8 people, while the rich received flats in the part of the quarter which was nearest the town and were just slightly better off. Next slide. In this slide, my grandmother speaks about her family's experience being forced from the home to the ghetto. And when she refers to the suburb, she's speaking about the ghetto, because before this, she lived in the center of Olkish, the city. So the ghetto and the suburb are the same thing.
And you were forced to move out to the suburbs.
Yeah.
What happened? With
But the soldiers came, the German, they said, take what you have, some clothes, and leave. That's what we did.
What did you feel when this happened? Where were you when this happened?
I was home, we all were home. Mother started to cry, but it didn't help. We had to leave.
She
But I
cried
was
to
born,
them?
Yes.
You were born there. This was the home that you
was
lived
that
in.
place, yeah.
Do you remember anything about the Germans? Do you remember anything about the person who came to the house to tell you about this?
They were soldiers.
They were just soldiers.
Just soldiers. They were, they told them to go to Jewish homes and tell them to leave. That's what we did.
So it was almost like a pogrom?
Yes, something like this you would say.
So how did you know where to go from there?
We didn't know. They showed us.
Oh, so they specified that you had to go to.
You go there, you go there, you go there. When they brought us there, my God, we looked around, how we're going to survive.
What was it like?
One room, so many people slept there, in one kitchen, whatever my mother can cook, she fed us.
Because conditions were so dire, some sought to smuggle in food and other necessities from outside the ghetto. If caught, the punishment was often death. At the beginning of 1942, 3 Jews in the Olkish ghetto were executed by hanging in order to warn local people against illegal trade. The men condemned to death went to the gallows, saying the prayer, Shema Yisrael. After the execution, the crowd was dismissed, and the condemned were left hanging till the following day as a warning sign. They were guarded by the German police. Next slide. In my conversation with my grandmother, I was amazed to learn that she herself snuck food back to her family during this time, despite the risk. She speaks a little about that experience and the woman who helped her in this following clip. The Polish woman who risked her life to help my grandmother's family is an example of an upstander, or a person who speaks or acts in support of an individual or cause, particularly someone who intervenes on behalf of a person being attacked or bullied, or in this case, persecuted against.
We moved from the city to the suburb. We had one room for 9 people in one small kitchen.
Was this after the Germans occupied Poland?
1939.
1939.
Yeah.
You moved from
the
suburbs,
city,
or from the city into the suburbs.
To the suburb, yes.
Okay.
And it was horrible, you know. We didn't have, the Germans already occupied everywhere. And then we didn't have, I had to, early in the morning, because it was night, I had to go there to a Paul, you know, old lady, and she gave me some bread and milk. And I was hitting the Star of David because we had to wear, and this way I could go back home.
This was when you were living now in the suburbs?
In the suburb,
You went to a Polish woman?
Yes.
To get bread?
She gave me bread and milk.
How did you know her? How did you meet her?
I met her, and she said, you know what, how you live now with 9 people is very hard. You can come up during in the morning or late in the evening, because when the German catch you, they're going to kill her too. That's what she
So
said.
she knew that you were Jewish?
Yes, she didn't.
So she helped you?
She helped me, yes.
Okay. But you had to hide the Jewish star so that you wouldn't get caught?
I had to hide. I was wearing like a shawl or something. And a scarf on my head, you know.
Where did she live in relation to where you lived?
She had a little farm on the other side up, you know.
Okay, okay.
In 1942, a large number of Jewish girls and women were deported from the Olkish ghetto to forced labor camps. In my research, I found a list that named these women. I was amazed to discover my grandmother's name in the list, surrounded by the names of her cousins, as seen by the red arrow on the bottom there. She's the very last name. Throughout her time in the camps, she managed to stay with her cousins Gutcha and Privka. Having someone close in the camps, a family member or friend, often gave the prisoners something to live for, despite the inhumane conditions. And this was the case with my grandmother and her cousins. All 3 of them survived. Next slide. According to my grandmother, she was in 7 camps over a span of 4 years. Here she talks about what this experience was like.
The common... Oh, go ahead.
You know, this German was good to me.
Yeah.
Because when later came woman to take over, because he went to the army, this guy, and you know, she pulled the hair. She didn't let us go to the bathroom. And there was from Hungary, I seen a girl falling dead because she couldn't go to the bathroom. She died 16 years old.
What were the camps like, Grandma? What were the living conditions like?
Oh, no warm water. And, you know, bunk beds. And then we get a slice of bread, so we cut it in 3 that we have in the morning and for lunch and at night, a very small piece of bread. And then we came home from work with just water and spinach in it. No meat, nothing. We were hungry. We were so hungry, we couldn't even get to sleep.
During her time in the camps, she worked a number of jobs, primarily in the kitchens, peeling potatoes and serving meals, as a seamstress, and as a laborer carrying iron and making gauges for German aircraft, Many of the camps she was in were satellite labor camps, but her last camp was called Peterswaldo, a subcamp of Gross-Rosen. She mentioned this camp as well as Klettendorf to me by name. There were about 1,000 Jewish women in the camp who were citizens of Poland, Hungary, France, and Holland. In May of 1945, Peterswaldo was liberated by the Russian army. Liberation did not mean the end for many of the survivors. They were sick, malnourished, and had no homes to return to. My grandmother said when the gates were open and the girls were allowed to leave, they didn't know where to go. Peterswaldo was close in proximity to a city named Reichenbach, and many of the survivors of Gross-Rosen ended up in Reichenbach after the war and built a new Jewish community there. It was there that my grandmother came back to life and met my grandfather, who had also been in the concentration camps. In these next 2 slides, my grandmother talks about settling in Reichenbach and meeting my grandfather, Harry.
you find? How did you meet with them?
Reichenbach. We went from Peterswald, that wasn't too far. It's called Reichenbach. And there was a big city, and there was the headquarters from the Russian. They took over. So, and they sent us there. And so I met Grandpa.
You met Grandpa.
And here she continues to talk about meeting my grandfather.
So then Grandpa started to court you. He wrote you love letters.
Love letters. Oh, I love these love letters so much.
You don't happen to have any of them.
No, I wish I would, because, you know, we traveled there after and we didn't know what to take. I wish I would have one letter.
Yeah.
But everything in Polish.
It was
you
all
know.
in Polish,
All in
sure.
Polish.
Do you remember anything that he said in the letters?
Oh my God, that life is so nice, and he's going to share everything with me and this. I love that. And my brother didn't let me marry because he said, it's too early for you. But, you know, he couldn't find anybody. Lady, he found his brothers, you know. And he said, no, I have to have you. And I said, fine. And we married by the Russian.
Wow, the Russian married you?
Yes, there was a rabbi, but you know what they did? It's good nobody was living upstairs. They put, how you call, bullets in the ceiling
Oh,
for
when
good
you got,
luck.
really? When you
I'm
got,
never going to forget this.
Wow.
Yes, that was a beautiful wedding.
I love hearing her voice. Well, my grandmother ended up living in a home abandoned by a high-ranking Nazi soldier. She first lived in a deserted hotel. When my grandmother spoke to me of Reichenbach, she said it was like a ghost town after the Germans evacuated, and survivors found lodging wherever they could. A resource that was of great help to me in writing my book and helping to illuminate what this was like was a thesis entitled "The Town Where the Jews Lived Twice." According to the author, when the Soviet troops entered Reichenbach on May 8, 1945, they found around the Hotel Kaiserhof the corpses of a number of German deserters hanged by the SS men prior to their withdrawal. It was amazing for me to see the images of this hotel where my grandmother first found shelter, and it's still standing today. Another location where she spent a lot of time was the synagogue, which survived the war. One story I found fascinating during my research was how the synagogue managed to survive when so many were destroyed. According to an article in the Israel National News, the synagogue of Reichenbach was in danger of being demolished under the Nazi regime. To save their beloved house of worship from this disaster, the Jewish community turned to Conrad Springer, a Gentile who worked as a maintenance man for the community before the war. Springer was given money by the members of the community to purchase the building from the German authorities. The synagogue was thus converted into the local headquarters for the Hitler Youth movement during the war. After the war, when remnants of the Jewish community returned to Reichenbach, Springer returned the keys of the synagogue to them without a request for payment. As a writer, I found the story of altruism so fascinating that I included Conrad Springer as a minor character in my novel. It also led me to wonder how many other small heroes or upstanders there were like him and the woman who helped my grandmother to smuggle food into the ghetto. Next slide. Ultimately, my grandparents decided to move to America. My grandmother speaks about this here.
What was your impression when Grandpa talked to you about going to America? What did you know about America at the time?
I didn't know too much. I heard America is supposed to be good, you know. We didn't want to stay in Germany anymore. I said the soil is blood. Wherever you go, you can see blood. That's what was in my mind, you know.
I believe it.
And I didn't want to stay anymore.
Wow, unbelievable.
Being able to write my grandmother's story has truly been a labor of love. My goal in writing what she lost was to capture her story for my own children. But since its publication, the story has become something more. It is a way for me to bear witness for a generation of survivors who will soon no longer be with us to tell what they lived through firsthand, and to make sure the lessons of the Holocaust are never forgotten. I'm pleased to say that what she lost is being read in schools to help further Holocaust education and honor the memory of those who both perished and survived. Next slide. And unfortunately today, we still see examples of intolerance and injustice in our world. If there is a lesson to be learned from the Holocaust, it is to be an upstander and to speak or act out against the injustice we see on both a personal and global level. Sadly, my grandmother passed away in February of 2020, only months before the COVID outbreak. It was a blessing that her family could be by her side in her last hours and have a proper funeral for her. The moments I spent with her will always hold a special place in my heart. And while what she lost is a fictionalized account of what my grandmother experienced, the events are based on real moments in history, and the characters are as real to me as the people that they're based on. These are some family pictures I love. Thank you so much for joining me today and allowing me to share my grandmother's life with you. I'm happy to answer any questions and hope that you will continue to learn how you can be an upstander as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Appreciate you being here this morning. If anybody in the audience has any questions, you are welcome to put them into the chat or the Q&A box as well. I did want to ask Melissa, so for Texas Holocaust Remembrance Week, it is all about educating students
Yes.
on the Holocaust. So how do you think knowing, or how do you believe knowing about and learning about the Holocaust can impact the future generations?
I think it is just important to see how an event like this was allowed to take place, how it happened on such a grand scale. And I feel that it wasn't unique to that time in history. That's something that could happen to any group of people today and going forward. So I think one of the main lessons is to be aware of the conditions that can cause something like this to happen, and to stand up and speak out as an upstander. As anyone in society can be a force for good and a force to stand out against this injustice. And I think that's why it's so important that particularly young students and those who are growing up in the world today are aware of the conditions that can cause something like this to happen, and to stand out against it. That makes sense.
It does, yes.
Okay.
We do have a question from the audience. They want to know, did your grandmother ever talk about what happened to the rest of her family?
Yes, she did. She did. And I do address this in the book. Unfortunately, only she and one brother survived. The rest of her family did perish. And I think that stayed with her. I also think that's why immediately after the war, when she met my grandfather, they got married very, very quickly. Like they'd only known each other a few months. And I think for so many survivors who had lost so much family, it was important to rebuild those human connections. And one of the things I learned is that there was like a wave of marriages and births afterwards, so that the Jewish survivors could feel a sense of coming back to life and bringing life back into the world. So I don't think that was unique to them. I think that was something that happened with a lot of the survivors. Yeah.
Thank you. One final question before we wrap up today. You mentioned in your presentation about being an upstander, not a bystander, and we are focusing a lot of our presentations this week encouraging students to be upstanders. But what do you think are ways that students can continue to honor the victims and survivors of the Holocaust?
The Holocaust. I think education is very important. I think being able to read books on the subject, visit museums that honor their memories. If there are survivors that are alive today, since that generation is slowly passing on, to hear their stories firsthand, and to continue their education process as they go through life, so that it's not just something that's in the pages of history. And I think that it's something, it's a living history, something that we need to continue to honor daily, so that it doesn't become something that we just read about in school books and then forget. I think that it's important that it through education and through exposure, students will continue to learn how important this lesson is.
Wonderful. Again, thank you so much for joining us, Melissa. We are always honored to have you join us here at the museum. And thank you to those of you that attended and are watching the live stream. We appreciate you being here this morning. Have a wonderful rest of your day.